Computers did not begin in the 20th century. In 1901, off the coast of a tiny Greek island called Antikythera, sponge divers dropped into black water and found something that had no business existing there: a corroded lump of bronze, tangled with gears finer than anything a clockmaker could cut. Decades of study later, the truth emerged. This was an analog computer, built more than 2,000 years before the transistor. Who built it? Why did a technology this advanced vanish from history for nearly 20 centuries? And was this truly the work of human hands alone, or something we still do not fully understand? What researchers eventually found inside that bronze would force historians to rewrite what they thought they knew. The story starts not with a scientist, but with a storm. In the spring of 1900, a small crew of Greek sponge divers was blown off course near the island of Antikythera, forced to wait out rough seas before diving in unfamiliar waters. When the weather cleared, one diver named Elias Stadiatis went down in his heavy canvas suit and copper helmet, expecting nothing but sponges and rock. Instead, he came up shaking, insisting he had seen a pile of dead bodies and horses lying on the seafloor. His captain assumed the pressure had confused him, until he went down himself and understood. Those were not corpses. They were bronze and marble statues, the cargo of an ancient ship that had sunk more than 2,000 years earlier and settled 40 meters below the surface. What followed was one of the first major underwater archaeological rescues in history, conducted by men with no formal training in archaeology, using primitive diving gear, in freezing conditions, at real risk to their lives. Over the following months, they hauled up statues, jewelry, glassware, and pottery from a Roman-era shipwreck believed to date to the 1st century BCE. Among the treasures brought to the surface was something far less impressive to look at: a shapeless, corroded chunk of bronze, cracked and covered in marine growth, sat largely ignored in a crate at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Compared to the statues, it looked like scrap. Some accounts suggest it nearly went unnoticed entirely, dismissed as a broken and uninteresting piece of debris. Then, months later, the lump split apart on its own as it dried out, and someone noticed a detail that made no sense for an object surrounded by 2,000-year-old pottery. Inside the corrosion were gears, precise, toothed, bronze gears, the kind nobody expected to see anywhere near the ancient world. Nobody in that room in Athens could explain what they were looking at. For decades, nobody could decide what to do with the object, because nobody could believe what it appeared to be. In 1902, Greek archaeologist Valerios Stais examined the fragments and proposed something audacious: that this was some kind of clock or astronomical instrument. The idea was met with resistance bordering on ridicule. Mainstream historians of the time held a firm assumption about the ancient world: that its engineering, however impressive in architecture and philosophy, simply did not extend to complex geared machinery. Clockwork of this precision was believed to be a medieval European invention, arriving more than 1,000 years later, so the device sat in a kind of intellectual limbo. Meanwhile, historians tried to make sense of the wreck itself. Analysis of the amphorae, coins, and statuae suggested the ship had likely been a cargo vessel from the Hellenistic world, possibly transporting looted or purchased treasures toward Rome, sometime in the 1st century BCE. Theories arose that it may have been carrying goods collected across the eastern Mediterranean, funneling art and instruments from Greek and Asian workshops toward wealthy Roman buyers. But whatever curiosity the corroded fragments generated, it was fragile and short-lived. 2 world wars swept across Europe in the decades that followed, and an odd bronze lump from a shipwreck simply could not compete for attention against the collapse and rebuilding of nations. The fragments were placed in storage. For nearly 50 years, the strange gears sat in a museum drawer, unexplained, waiting for someone stubborn enough to take them seriously again. Museum staff catalogued it and moved on to other priorities, because there was no obvious way to study something that contradicted everything historians assumed about ancient engineering. It took an outsider, willing to trust physical evidence over accepted narrative, to pick the puzzle back up. That someone arrived in the 1950s. in the form of a British-born science historian named Derek de Solla Price. Price had a talent for looking at old things and refusing to accept an easy explanation for them. He became fascinated by the Antikythera fragments and pushed for a level of scientific scrutiny nobody had applied before. Since simply looking at the corroded surface revealed almost nothing, Price turned to a technology far newer than the object itself: X-rays. Working with Greek physicist Charalampos Karakalos, he had the fragments imaged, hoping to see past the corrosion into whatever structure lay hidden beneath centuries of bronze disease. What the X-rays revealed stunned him. Inside the largest fragment was a nest of interlocking gears, more than 24 of them, meshed together with a level of intricacy that had no known parallel anywhere in the ancient or even medieval record. Price spent years piecing together what the gear trains might have done, eventually proposing that the device was some kind of calendar computer, capable of tracking astronomical cycles. In 1974, he published his findings in a lengthy, technical, but genuinely startling paper, and gave a broader account of it to readers of Scientific American. The idea that the ancient Greeks had built a functioning mechanical computer centuries before anything comparable sent ripples through the historical community. Price had not solved every mystery of the device, but he had done something more important. He had proven, beyond reasonable doubt, that dismissing the Antikythera mechanism as an oddity was no longer intellectually defensible. Price himself never lived to see the full picture come into focus, but his work became the foundation that every later researcher built on, and it planted a simple, stubborn idea in the historical record. The ancient world still had secrets left to give up. So what exactly could this thing do? As imaging technology improved over the following decades, the answer became almost unbelievable. The mechanism contains at least 30 separate bronze gears, some with teeth cut to a precision comparable to a fine 18th century instrument, not something expected from a workshop 2,000 years earlier. Turning a hand crank on the side set the entire gear train into motion, driving pointers across dials on the front and back of the device. On the front, a dial tracked the position of the sun and moon against the zodiac, while a separate mechanism modeled the moon's irregular motion, using a clever system of gears mounted slightly off-center, mimicking the way the moon appears to speed up and slow down in its orbit. On the back, a spiral dial tracked a 19-year lunar-solar calendar cycle known to Babylonian astronomers, allowing the user to align lunar months with the solar year. A second spiral dial tracked something remarkable: the timing of solar and lunar eclipses, potentially years in advance, based on a cycle the Babylonians called the Saros. As if that were not enough, one small dial tracked the 4-year cycle of Pan-Hellenic athletic games, including the Olympics, letting the user know, at a glance, where in the athletic calendar a given year fell. Taken together, this was not a toy or a curiosity. It was a functioning analog computer for astronomy and timekeeping, built with a level of miniaturized precision that historians long assumed did not reappear in Europe until astronomical clocks emerged in the 14th century, over 1,000 years later. To put that gap in perspective, the person who built this device understood gear ratios and orbital irregularities well enough to encode them in bronze, at a time when most of the world still measured the passage of years by watching shadows move across the ground. If the mechanism was this advanced, an obvious question follows: who actually built it? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, and that gap has fueled a century of speculation. Some early researchers wondered whether it could be connected to Archimedes, the legendary engineer and mathematician of Syracuse, since ancient writers described him building mechanical models of the heavens. Archimedes was killed in 212 BCE, decades before the estimated construction date of the mechanism itself. So a direct link is difficult to prove, though some scholars argue the device may represent a design tradition he helped originate. Other researchers point toward the island of Rhodes, home to a renowned school of astronomy and engineering in the Hellenistic period, and associated with astronomers like Hipparchus, whose lunar theory closely matches the moon-tracking gearing found in the device. Alexandria, with its famous library and tradition of mechanical inventors, is another candidate for where such expertise might have originated. Ancient literary evidence adds tantalizing support to the idea that devices like this existed and were even known outside a single workshop. The Roman writer Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, described a bronze sphere built by Archimedes that modeled the motions of the sun, moon, and planets, and mentioned similar devices built by others afterward. That means the Antikythera mechanism was probably not a lone invention, but the survivor of a broader tradition of Greek mechanical astronomy, a tradition whose other instruments have simply never been found intact. Whoever the individual craftsman actually was, they were almost certainly trained within a lineage of workshops that no longer exists in any written record, leaving us with a machine but no signature, a masterpiece with no named master. The gap between what the ancient world was assumed capable of and what this device proves it achieved has invited darker and more speculative theories. Some ask whether this level of knowledge was deliberately restricted, held within a small circle of astronomers, priests, or engineers, rather than shared broadly, which might explain why so few written records describe it in detail. Others focus on a more grounded question: why did this level of precision engineering apparently disappear for centuries afterward? One widely discussed explanation points to the instability that followed the decline of the Hellenistic kingdoms and the eventual fragmentation of the Roman world, an era in which many centers of learning were disrupted, libraries were lost, and specialized crafts, requiring years of accumulated expertise, simply had no way to be passed on. It is a sobering reminder that technological progress is not automatic or guaranteed, and that entire branches of knowledge can vanish if the conditions that sustain them collapse. This has led some to argue more broadly that ancient civilizations may have reached technical heights we still underestimate, hidden behind gaps in the surviving record. Skeptics counter that one exceptional device does not prove a lost civilization of advanced technology, only that a handful of brilliant individuals, working within a real tradition of mechanical astronomy, built something extraordinary that we are lucky to have recovered at all. Comparisons are often drawn to devices from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but nothing found there approaches the same combination of miniaturized gearing and astronomical function. What makes the mystery linger is not a single missing fact, but the sheer size of the silence around it, an entire discipline of precision mechanics that seems to appear once in the record and then goes quiet for 1,000 years. Understanding the mechanism in detail required tools that did not exist when it was pulled from the sea. Beginning around the year 2000 and accelerating through the following 2 decades, researchers turned to high-resolution computed tomography scanning, essentially giving the fragments a full 3-dimensional CT scan, far more detailed than Price's early X-rays. This let scientists digitally peel through layers of corroded bronze without physically damaging the fragile pieces, revealing gear teeth, pins, and internal structures previously invisible. Alongside this, specialized surface imaging techniques captured faint traces of inscriptions engraved directly onto the metal, text so worn and shallow it was effectively invisible to the naked eye. Piecing together thousands of these tiny characters, researchers reconstructed what amounts to an ancient instruction manual, describing the dials, their functions, and how to read them. Using all of this data, teams of researchers and engineers built working physical and digital reconstructions of the device, testing whether their theories about its gearing actually produced accurate astronomical results. In several cases, this process revealed small manufacturing errors in the original device, places where the ancient craftsman had made a slight miscalculation in a gear ratio, evidence that this was a real handmade object, built by a real person, not a myth or forgery. These reconstructions also confirmed working theories about specific dials and pointers, effectively allowing modern researchers to turn the crank on a 2,000-year-old machine and watch it perform exactly as its builder intended. Watching a modern replica turn in sync with real astronomical data after a century of guesswork was described by more than one researcher as one of the most moving moments of their career. None of this technology existed in a vacuum. Someone owned this device, used it, and valued it enough to carry it aboard a ship bound for a wealthy destination. Given its complexity and precision, most researchers assume it was commissioned by someone with real resources, an astronomer, a wealthy patron, or possibly even political or religious authority, since tracking eclipses and calendars carried enormous significance in the ancient world. Predicting a solar or lunar eclipse was not simply an academic exercise. In many ancient cultures, eclipses were tied directly to omens, political legitimacy, and religious ritual, meaning the ability to predict one in advance carried real influence over public perception and decision-making. A device like this would have let its owner anticipate cosmic events that everyone else experienced as sudden and frightening, a form of knowledge that functioned almost like power. Given the skill and materials required to build it, some researchers believe the mechanism itself may have been among the most valuable objects on the ship, worth more in craftsmanship than many of the statues it traveled alongside. Its loss, then, was not simply the loss of a bronze curiosity. It represented the disappearance of an entire branch of applied knowledge into the sea, taking with it techniques of gear cutting and astronomical modeling that would not be matched again for well over 1,000 years. Imagine the owner standing on the deck of that ship, checking the device before a long voyage, never suspecting that a storm would send both the vessel and this small miracle of engineering to the bottom of the Mediterranean, where it would sit in darkness for more than 2,000 years before anyone laid eyes on it again. Everything about that owner, their name, their profession, even the reason they were traveling, sank along with the ship and has never been recovered. The legacy of this device extends far beyond the fragments themselves. Some historians view it as a distant ancestor of the mechanical clock tradition that eventually emerged in medieval Europe, even though no direct chain of transmission has ever been proven. Whether or not that connection is literal, the comparison sticks, because both represent the same basic idea, using precisely cut gears to model the passage of time and the motion of the heavens. Many researchers have called it the world's first known analog computer, a machine that solved a problem, predicting astronomical positions, purely through mechanical calculation rather than direct observation. Beyond its engineering, the device carries a heavier cultural lesson. It shows how easily sophisticated knowledge can be lost, not through some dramatic catastrophe, but through the slow erosion of the institutions, workshops, and teachers who once carried it forward. Modern scientists who have studied the mechanism closely often describe a genuine sense of humility in the process, an acknowledgement that the people who built it were operating at a level of ingenuity that took the modern world 2,000 years and entirely different tools to rediscover and finally understand. Today, the surviving fragments are carefully preserved and displayed at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, treated not as scrap metal anymore, but as one of the most important surviving objects from the ancient world. Visitors now stand in front of a small case of corroded bronze fragments that look, at first glance, almost unremarkable, and it is only once someone explains what those fragments actually do that the room usually goes quiet. That contrast between how ordinary the object looks and how extraordinary its function turned out to be is part of why the story still captivates people who encounter it for the first time. The mechanism's story is far from finished. In recent years, researchers have made a growing amount of their imaging data and reconstructions publicly available, inviting historians, engineers, and independent researchers around the world to keep testing and refining theories about exactly how every gear and dial functioned. Even now, certain details remain debated, including the precise function of a few smaller dials and pointers whose purpose is still not universally agreed upon. That incompleteness is part of what keeps the mechanism so compelling. It suggests we still do not have the full picture of ancient technical capability. It raises an uncomfortable and fascinating question. If one such device survived by pure chance, pulled from a shipwreck that could easily have gone unnoticed, how many other advanced instruments from the ancient world are still sitting on the seafloor, or buried in soil, waiting for someone to notice a strange lump of corroded metal and refuse to throw it away? Beyond the mechanism itself, the story is a reminder of why historical and archaeological research matters, not as a nostalgic exercise, but as an ongoing correction to our assumptions about where human ingenuity has actually been throughout history. In the end, the device asks a quiet but pointed question of everyone who hears its story. Given everything modern technology allows us to do, are we truly certain we understand more about the universe than the person who built this machine did, more than 2,000 years ago? Perhaps the real lesson of the Antikythera mechanism is not about the ancient world at all, but about our own certainty, and how much of what we now consider impossible might simply be a discovery that has not been made yet, sitting somewhere in the dark, still waiting.